Greetings, everybody, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Djene, in for Jason Miles on this Wednesday evening because it's Wednesday. And if it's Wednesday, you know what it is. It's White Guy Wednesday on This is Revolution. Now, my fellow white guys, my dear friend Dr. Kuba and my dear friend C. Derek Vaughn are taking a rest tonight. They need to lie down in the dark to ensure that they don't become too melanated for This is Revolution. But don't you worry. We have an exciting show this evening, and we have a wonderful guest to talk about a very important and interesting topic, which is anti-imperialism, and specifically a response to the article that I published, I think maybe a month and a bit ago now, in Compact, where I critiqued some of the positions of the anti-imperialist left and the way that they looked at the world. And our guest for today had a response to that. But before we begin, I would like to remind you all to like and subscribe if you can to the show. Consider becoming a patron. All money goes to Jason Miles to ensure that he can live and continue to bring all the great content that you know best on This is Revolution. So without further ado, allow me to bring on our guest today, Pavlos Papadopoulos. He is an assistant professor at Wyoming Catholic College. That is a liberal arts college in Wyoming, as you may guess by the title. And we were just discussing off air about the interesting program they have. He teaches the Humanities. They have a great books program, which is it's an approach to learning which has people discuss and analyze some of the significant works in the Western canon, as it were, but also what I've discovered, they also do outdoor stuff. So you can study horse riding, which I think is kind of pretty cool. I wish more universities had options like that. You know, a bit of horse riding never did anyone any harm. So I'm fully supportive of that. Welcome to the show, Pavlos.
Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality, for inviting me on. Thank you for the article itself. I think it was a really helpful contribution to this popular discourse on anti-imperialism, and thank you for the provocation causing me to write my own article and then responding with the invitation.
Well, I really appreciate it when people actually respond to things, because, you know, so much of discourse is people talking past each other. So, you know, although you had some strong criticism for my piece, I appreciated what you wrote, and it made me think about how I at least how I framed my argument, and perhaps certainly some of the problems that come up with my argument, which I fully recognize. So just to give people a little bit of context before we go on to talking about your article, and I just want to show people it so people can check it out. So it's published in the American Conservative, and it is called A Richer Anti-Imperialism. I have it here in the background. It's in the doobly-doo down below, so please go ahead and read it if you can. Which of course you can, because you're a good reading public. Our TIR people are good readers. They may not read all the great books, but they definitely at least do the basic readings. So before we talk about your critiques, just to get people up to speed, you know, I wrote this article in Compact magazine like a couple of weeks back, 6 weeks back or something. And my critique was basically, I was kind of tired of the way a lot of the discourse about American empire and anti-imperialism gets put forward, at least amongst certain elements of the left. And specifically this idea that, you know, America is this kind of sui generis evil, and ergo, anyone opposing America must be morally defensible. They must be the good guys. And my critique was that, you know, while I kind of understand that impulse, and certainly, you know, American empire, the managers of American empire, the acolytes in the media, certainly at times fabricate accusations against certain countries about the latest brutalities or barbarisms. That's not always the case. And my point was, instead of waging our critique of empire by trying to, or at least by focusing on debunking the lies of the imperialists, my position was that it's kind of irrelevant whether or not the accusations of the imperialists are true or not. Our task should be up to oppose empire at home and the military-industrial complex, because even if, on their own grounds, you can kind of defend an intervention on the grounds of perhaps this intervention might save lives, the overall cost of mobilizing American empire and the apparatus of American empire is to further entrench that empire. And I kind of implied this at the beginning. I think the Second World War is a good example of that. I mean, we might all kind of support fighting Hitler and say, we use the American empire to fight Hitler. That was a devil's bargain. But, the upshot of the Second World War was the construction of this enormous military-industrial complex that in the subsequent decades has had, an enormous human cost on society. So my kind of idea was like, let's keep our eyes on the prize. Let's focus on opposing empire, and let's not get bogged down in debating the rights and wrongs of particular interventions, or spend our time defending the indefensible regimes, because ultimately we're fighting our battles on our opponent's terrain. We're arguing over the veracity of the case for a neoconservative or a liberal intervention in countries outside the United States. So that was my idea. That was my that was kind of the idea I was trying to get across in that article. Perhaps I didn't do it as well as I should have, but I'd like to turn it over to you, Pavlos, and ask you about, first of all, what was your critique of my article? What perhaps, give me the old compliment sandwich. Give me something you didn't like, something you liked, and then finish on something you didn't like.
I wonder if I'll invert the sandwich there, but we'll see how this goes. I read your piece and I found myself nodding along with sort of the main arc of the argument, but then being disturbed by these little blips in it, these little asides and comments that you would make. Where you land, as you've just described, is where you land in the article, that a better argument, the best argument that should be deployed by those of us concerned about the American empire as it currently exists, is that every intervention strengthens and further legitimizes and further bloats the military-industrial complex. And you noted sort of the two negatives to that: one negative for foreign populations, and one negative for the American domestic population, and indeed the American form of government. You at least alluded to that, and I agree with you on that fundamental point, that I think the growth and maintenance of American empire in the last century, and then especially last half century, has been corrosive for our own form of government. It has been destructive to many foreign societies, and the blood of hundreds of thousands or millions is on the hands of imperial misadventures that we have undertaken. However, as a citizen of the United States, and as a political thinker and someone who sort of teaches topics around this area, I would want to rest the weight of the argument somewhere else, sort of the center of the argument somewhere else, which is really maintenance of our own regime and trying to shore up what remains of our Republican form of government, trying to exercise good government for the good of our domestic population. So to back up a little bit and note the points of criticism that I had, my article picks up on and then sort of tries to gather and then attack a number of passing references you make to crimes committed by foreign regimes abroad. And in the context of your argument, you make these aside comments to these crimes and atrocities. And the sense I got from your argument was that those were noted by you as if those would be legitimate counter arguments to resisting an intervention. Maybe actually we would have to. So you were saying we shouldn't spend our time debunking every claim to a foreign regime's atrocity because we're suspicious that it'll lead the neocons and their Democrat allies to commit us to intervention. Because in fact, there are cases where there are atrocities, and there are cases where American intervention has prevented those or stopped those. And my argument is really that's not the main point. We actually have to take a further step back and give a new frame for thinking about government, politics, republic, empire, foreign policy altogether. You make a comment at one point that there is this long tradition of homegrown opposition to America's foreign entanglements and expansionist ambitions. And I sort of picked up on that and ran with it. And the last part of my article is saying, let me go to my favorite part of that long tradition that's native to America. Your own examples at the beginning of your article of lies that were used by American elites to build empire starts with the Mexican-American War, right? The Thornton Affair, right? Abraham Lincoln's spot resolutions, you're sort of alluding to Whig opposition to the Mexican War. And it got me thinking, well, what comes before that? Of course, my friend John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams is this great conservative statesman, Secretary of State, and then later a one-term president, who in 1821 gives a wonderful address on July 4th, discussing the Declaration of Independence. And in the course of that, he has this really prophetic passage about what would happen if American foreign policy deviated from the principles of politics that are contained in the Constitution and especially the Declaration of Independence. And so it's a kind of thoroughly American. Today we would call it a thoroughly conservative because it's sort of taking its sights from the Declaration of Independence, not necessarily the GOP as it exists today, but thoroughly conservative in the American context way of formulating foreign policy. And in John Quincy Adams's interpretation, what the foreign policy message of the Declaration of Independence is: republicanism, preserve republicanism at home, be very cautious about interventions abroad, and especially be cautious about the siren song of humanitarian intervention, as we would call it today, or interventions on behalf of the liberty of foreign peoples. John Quincy Adams says, we will always be the well-wisher of freedom everywhere, but we will be the guarantor only of our own freedom and our own liberties. And if we deviate from that principle, what will wind up happening over time is the use of really tyrannical power against foreigners abroad, which you start to see at least in the Philippines, if not earlier in American history, but very clearly there is this kind of prefigurement of Vietnam, and also the corruption of our own regime at our home, our own Republican form of government at home.
Okay, I mean, you quote, you have an extensive quote from Adams in the piece, which I would point people to take a look at. The way I view this, though, is to a certain degree, Adams's position represents kind of a contradiction in the American Revolution. You obviously describe it as a conservative impulse, but it also has a revolutionary impulse in it as well, like this revolutionary republicanism, this enlightenment values, and this notion of not becoming entangled in these wars, which at the time obviously were often dynastic wars, which were seen as irrational and reactionary and part of the past. Of course, I can see how today that this would obviously be seen as something as conservative, but for its time, it was a kind of radical idea. So, and a radical way of looking at the world, which of course conflicted, with the inherent contradiction of America as a anti-colonial revolution, as an Enlightenment political project, but one that's also built on slavery, but perhaps from the perspective of our argument, the annihilation of the Native American population. So I think there is a kind of, there's a kind of radicalism, a kind of bourgeois radicalism inherited from the American Revolution. I mean, if you want to come at it from the Marxist perspective. But I think that's a very important aspect of opposing imperialism that I think gets lost if we end up focusing the debate on the rights and wrongs of a particular intervention. So my response to you would be is that the reason I was highlighting the cases that where you could make a quote unquote humanitarian case for intervention is because if we're focusing our debate on that subject, on debunking the veracity of particular claims, if we are resting our anti-imperialism on the idea that the imperialists always lie and everyone opposing the imperialists are good or at the very least defensible, we're going to end up in a kind of reinforcing liberal interventionism in the negative, as you observe, because we are, by focusing in that way, as you point out, making the case. Well, is there actually a case for a moral intervention? And this isn't a new thing. And I think you're alluding to this because this is certainly something that Adams is talking about. I just finished a fascinating book on European interventions into the Levant in the early 19th century, called Dangerous Gifts, which talks about how the imperial security nexus and the humanitarian emancipatory messages became mixed up with one another as imperial powers fought over the fate of the Ottoman Empire, and how intervention on humanitarian grounds, whether that was in the Levant with the Christian Muslim massacres, whether that was the Greek War of Independence, or whether that was the Bulgarian uprising or the Armenian question, these interventions, there was perhaps a humanitarian ground, but the point was that these interventions were essentially in the 19th century enhancing the position of an imperial military. We see this in Marxist journalism, for example, on the Indian revolt, on how he talks about how it's less about extracting wealth from India, but imperialism for Palmerston became a way basically to eviscerate Parliament and establish a strong premiership in the United Kingdom. And I think that's an important thing that you're highlighting. As a conservative, you want to defend the Republican system of government. And correct me if I'm wrong, is that the ideal that you have, and I'd like you to expand on this if you can, is that we have that in the United States, rather than having this imperial presidency that is rested on the bayonets of the military-industrial complex and the Department of Homeland Security, your dream is a kind of where you have a truly deliberative parliamentary body, you have truly co-equal branches of government, you don't have this elevation of the presidency over the legislature, which is not what the founders initially intended, and that you want to have this to be couched in a vibrant civil society that isn't sort of mobilized into these cult of personality presidential campaigns and people rallying behind politics as football teams rather than as kind of something we debate in civil society. Would that be a fair assessment of how you would envisage this Republican system of government? And if so, could you expand? And if not, could you correct me where I'm wrong?
Sure. Yeah. I would like our government at every level, local, county, state, federal, to serve the good of the people under its charge, who are the source of its legitimacy in our system of government, and to whom our governors, in the broad sense of mayors up to president, are responsible, and for whom they are responsible, or to whom they should be responsible, although very often they wind up being totally irresponsible in both senses of the term irresponsible. Yes, and so I would like a restoration, to the extent that it's possible, of greater liberty for communities at the local and state level. I would like greater recognition of federalism in the sense of the federal government being strong and effective in precisely the modes and purposes that are proper to it, and having a clear sense of the goals of the tasks that are given to it, so that's what I might refer to as domestic imperialism, right? There's this kind of correspondence and dynamic between you grow the empire abroad, and then your Republican form of government at home becomes an imperial form of government, right, over your own people. And you have, as you mentioned, Department of Homeland Security, I might add FBI, and really a whole array of agencies increasingly viewing segments of the American population as domestic enemies, domestic terrorists, not because they're trying to blow up buildings or anything like that, but because they hold the wrong opinions, the opinions that contradict the animating ideology of our liberal worldwide empire. So yes, I would like to oppose American empire because I think it causes destruction abroad to other people, and I don't want that any of those events to happen. As I'll be more conservative and more old school than the founders. I'll go back to Plato and Aristotle and Scripture and say that the criminal, the person who commits an unjust act, is harming his own soul as well as harming the bodies and possibly souls of others. And so and George Washington recognized this as well in Farewell Address, that we need to conduct our foreign policy in accordance with honor and obligations and so on, and treat others fairly. It's in our own interest, our deepest interest in terms of our soul and the character of our individuals, communities, and nation, to be just towards others. So yes, I would like to remove the obstacles that are clustered around what we call the military-industrial complex of the security state, the obstacles to greater, more robust self-government, greater liberties for communities and individuals and families within the United States. And so the sort of shifting the framework of thinking about foreign policy and government that I tried to propose in my article in response to yours was really a kind of pivot to thinking about duty. To whom does the United States government and the United States military owe its primary duty? And I am very wary of the interventionist arguments that I would say wind up justifying all kinds of interventions for all kinds of purposes, some of them well-intentioned, some of them very ill-intentioned. I'm very wary of those humanitarian intervention arguments because they confuse the fundamental issue. And the fundamental issue is, when someone has power, what do they have that power for, and who are they responsible for exercising that power to protect or to benefit? And the answer of the American Constitution and the Declaration and the Western tradition that I would want to pull into this conversation, both Enlightenment and pre-modern, is they hold this power on behalf of the people who are under them, not on behalf of someone else. And I would get theological for a moment and say that our governors are answerable to God for the way that they discharge their duty or fail to discharge their duty. To whom? Primarily to their own people, to the people who have put them in charge, to whom they are answerable, for whom they are answerable. Now, I don't want to say that this is a simple solution, because if we sort of return to my ideal of a government that understood itself as being dedicated to securing the blessings of liberty to us and our posterity, as the preamble to the Constitution puts it, there would still be thorny questions that would come up, such as in a neighboring country, let's just say Mexico, there's a failed state, and narco-terrorists run large swaths of that state, and we have been complicit in that history for a very long time in our government and in our population's addiction to drugs. And even if we weren't, it's just a mess on our border, and it's a threat to us. But it's also, even when it's not a threat to us, there are just great atrocities happening in very close distance to us, and that's a kind of moral conundrum. Fine, I don't think that my framework shift solves or preempts sort of the solution to all those problems. But I think there is that mentality shift that we need, which is that our governors should be understood as being responsible to the people of their nations primarily, and arguments for intervention abroad, if there is going to be intervention abroad, those better clear the hurdle of this is in your best interest, or this does not contradict your best interest, or this does not contribute to the further erosion of your liberties and the goods that our government is supposed to secure for us, our own population.
I mean, I would frame that differently, but I would certainly, on a functional level, kind of agree with the practical conclusion from that, because I mean, even when you look at let's say a crisis in a place like Mexico, another question is that I think should always be asked is intervening going to make it worse or better? I mean, America's already intervening in there.
Yep. Yep.
America is already responsible for that crisis in Mexico. You know, you have guns going one way, drugs going another way. It's the market, baby. So, you know, even if people can say, look at all these terrible things, I think, you know, a kind of a second plank to my criticism of imperialism is that, you know, also we have to be cognizant that very rarely can you make the case that, you know, even in a terrible situation where terrible things are happening, that some kind of military intervention from the United States, however cathartic perhaps to certain people, to feel like you're doing something, or that the state that represents you is doing something, very often it's going to make things worse. You know, do you think Gaddafi was going to like shower the people of Benghazi with flowers? Probably not. But you know, we had a military intervention. It went beyond the mandate that it was supposed to be intervened on. Once you unleash the dogs of war, they don't come back to the lead very easily. And there are all kinds of unintended consequences that,
the whole migration crisis in Europe following that is, at least, you know, there's Syria, there's lots of things going on that feed into that. The return of the slave trade to Libya. I mean, the list goes on. It's terrible. It's really a terrible series of side effects. And
if we want to look at why so much of Latin America is a basket case, is because, you know, I mean, the argument I would always have when, you know, as someone of Kurdish origin, it was quite difficult for me to oppose the Iraq war on a kind of personal, visceral level. But, you know, in subsequent years, I kind of feel vindicated, because it's like, look, Syria exploded without American intervention, and it's a bloodbath. America and everybody else got involved and obviously made it worse. Iraq was, you know, kicked down, perhaps prematurely, and that was a bloodbath as well. You know, at the end of the day, it's probably better when a bloodbath happens. At the very least, America shouldn't be there being implicated in it and making it worse. And so that's, you know, that's one side of it. And but I think, you know, your focus on, you know, the theological way that you put it, that, you know, when you do the crime, you're hurting yourself as well. And I think that's something, you know, I think that's something that people, I think that's something that people on the left, I mean, I think they know and they think about, but I think it's often secondary to this self-interested argument, which I think is one worth making, saying like, look, even if you don't care about these black and brown people over there, you know, fine. But this state exercising them is hurting your own interests. And so there's also a kind of rational appeal to it as well. You know, that we should be making this case. It's like, it's not just a, you know, like a good to do. It's in your own interest, because look at the state that rules us now.
Yeah, and even if you don't buy sort of the argument about the existence of the soul and you're harming the soul and whatever that means, let's just posit for a minute that American servicemen commit some atrocity abroad and then come home and they're discharged from service. Haven't you made your society, even if you don't believe about the soul or whatever, haven't you made your society worse just by having like people who at one point were heavily armed, know how to use arms in lots of ways, probably are going to have PTSD or worse instances of PTSD from having committed really horrible acts, or being put in a situation where they wind up committing horrible acts, and how responsible are they? Sure, maybe in some cases they're really fully responsible. Do you want to multiply the number of people in your communities, in your nation, who have gone through that horrible action of committing horrible acts to other human beings? No, you've actually made your country worse. And so help those people to the extent that you can when they do exist, when we've already crossed that bridge, but also try to, on a very sort of personal level, just thinking about the individuals involved, try to avoid getting your nation into that circumstance. Then there's the larger structural question of, right, the strengthening of the military-industrial complex. And I'll actually, I'll plug, excuse me for doing this, I'll plug a piece of my own from American Conservative from the 60th anniversary of Eisenhower's farewell address, where we get that term military-industrial complex from a year or two ago. And really, when I sat down and thought about and went back and read carefully his farewell address, it's so much worse than he saw then. It's so much worse than he could have predicted. If you think about the way in which that complex has grown and the way in which the things he predicted about the corruption of our liberties, the corruption of our form of government, so much of that has come to pass. He even Eisenhower speaks in 1961 of the capture of society by a scientific technological elite. And I would make the argument that we saw that sort of proven over the course of COVID, but then also just his comments about intelligence services and the military corrupting domestic politics. It's not just through pork that is passed in Congress for like this money goes to this district for its military base. That's the most benign version of this corruption. I think that again, speaking as a conservative, or just an observer of American politics, since 2015, it's just been, in my perspective, pretty undeniable that large swaths of our intelligence services, our federal law enforcement, and even our military feel comfortable intervening in American politics when they disagree with the outcome. And I find that terrifying and really disturbing. And I find it very hard to sort of put the genie back in that bottle. And so the military-industrial complex is one part of what we call the administrative state, this sort of sprawling fourth branch of government that is not really accountable to anyone and is very hard to pare back. Someone once called that the swamp. I'm sure we've all heard of that. And so I guess I see the fight against the military and industrial complex as one aspect of this fight that conservatives and even libertarians, and I am not a libertarian, but even libertarians will argue for, which is we need to pare back the administrative state. And yet, when we get the budget deal from just a week or two ago, AEI, the conservative think tank, American Enterprise Institute, put out an op-ed just a few days ago saying, the budget deal was good in so many ways, but the one problem is that it cut defense spending. Okay, if it cuts defense spending, like that's certainly a good thing about it. And yet, there's never enough money for our defense contractors and for our military-industrial complex.
I mean, I think this is an extremely important point to make, about how imperialism, not in the kind of Leninist sense of colonialism, resource extraction, but imperialism as a domestic political dynamic, basically subjugates society to what you would call the administrative state, what I might call the bourgeois or the capitalist state. It subjects them, and it basically increasingly makes the public irrelevant. I mean, my good friend Daniel Bessner, Professor Daniel Bessner, who's also works with Quincy, makes this point all the time that this new technologies that the U.S. military are having means that they just can do the kind of military policies that they kind of want to do, because they don't need to consult the public. The Congress has basically given up we don't declare war anymore on anybody. It's just these endless police actions. And the military is virtually unaccountable in terms of, you are emotionally blackmailed into like support. If you don't support an increase in the military budget, you don't support the troops, you don't support our boys. And it's a kind of it's a dirty trick, which I see conservatives doing, and I see MSNBC national security liberals doing as well. That you have to support this security apparatus, which it's not. And I think one of the things I wanted to get across in my article, and I don't know whether you agree with me on this or not, is that I think both on the left and the right, for different reasons, you have perhaps a prevailing notion of almost a conspiratorial notion of how this military industrial complex works. Like you have these like this cabal of people who are directing things in a very specific way. But I think it's more benign than that, which makes it more terrifying, is that it's the self-licking ice cream. Like it you know, these military spending begets more military spending. People, it's not like one big plan. It's like 1,000,001 contracting grifts that are you know. And you know, I make this point. My friend and co-host on TIR, Dr. Kuba, makes this point. You know, when we look at what the Iraq War was about, or you know, obviously nobody would have invaded Iraq if there was no oil, and if it wasn't like an important country strategically. But if you're looking for where the money came from, it was just them kicking open the U.S. Treasury and like pilfering trillions in the name of a war on terror, which is probably, you know, which is worse than Vietnam in terms of its scale of human suffering, and has unleashed hell in large parts of the Middle East. That has unintentional, you know, it's like there's the conspiratorial view where like Obama created ISIS. It's like, no, Obama wasn't sitting in the White House like on the phone to al-Baghdadi, like but like more broadly you can say that America created conditions where these kind of things came up, even if that wasn't the intention. And I think, you know, sometimes people will say, well, it's just a matter of doing empire better. That's the Niall Ferguson neoconservative line. Let's just do empire better. But I just don't. The very nature of what imperialism is means that it can never be better. It will always be like this.
And I think it's really important, as you've done and these others have done, to sort of draw our attention to the banality of the grift and of the military contractor, and even just of like the habits. And or you could also say, as some people talk about, you know, why do we still view Russia as like the Soviet Union, except right wing or something like that, but still evil? You know, there were all of those specialists who are training for generations during the Cold War, and there were all of that intelligence on Russia. And like at a certain point in the 1990s, you have to do something with those people. Like you have to give them something to do, and so you keep pushing Russia back. And so in a way, there's, on the one hand, there's those kind of material conditions that are so crucial to keep in mind. I think the thing that I tried to call attention to in my piece in particular was maybe the ideological conditions. And as you mentioned with your example of European interventions in the Levant in the 19th century, this strange complex between the structures of imperial bureaucracy or the military and humanitarian organizations and humanitarian rationale, right? This is a moral question. And I'm not sure we're going to untangle this imperial mess unless we confront the moral question. It's not at all sufficient, but I think it would be necessary along with confronting these sort of material and bureaucratic questions that you called our attention to, right? We today are a kind of humanitarian empire, and we justify our intervention and our war in Ukraine, among others, for ideological reasons and humanitarian reasons. And you could see Bush's second inaugural address, right? This amazingly utopian, hubristic statement of democratic messianism, and even his statements immediately after 9/11. They sort of ramp up in the immediate weeks after 9/11 from we're going to get the bad guys to we need to crush out evil everywhere in the world if we are going to ever live in peace. And crushing out evil means making them like us. There's this kind of tendency towards the homogenization of the globe. We need to have gender studies, pride flags, liberal democracy, market democracy. Sort of, it's on like the economic side and the social side. It's economic liberalism and social liberalism. We need to have that everywhere in the world, especially in Russia, or else we're never going to be at peace. And speaking as a social conservative and a religious conservative in America, that same kind of imperial operation is happening domestically. Those just seem like two sides of the same coin. That the imperial capital wants to spread a certain ideology that happens to be socially or culturally on the left, and economically on the right to the entire world and to all of the provinces in the homeland. And so that would be that colors my own anti-imperialism.
I mean, I think certainly, again, for me, the question is less about the, obviously I am very supportive of a kind of social liberalism, or perhaps social libertarianism, where I'm like, let's have people be free to practice things in their own life, their sexuality, right. All these kind of things, and equally, I'm certainly against, condemning people for wanting to live perhaps in a more quote unquote conservative mode. I remember one of my conservative friends here in Springfield once said to me, he goes like, Djene, you're a socialist, but you live like an evangelical. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes like, well, you have a wife, 2 kids, you go to work, you have dogs. It's like, yeah, I just like to just have a normal life. It's totally fine. It's like, it's nothing like, I don't think there's, I don't think there's anything. I mean, like, honestly, I mean, my personal opinion is like, it's fine how people want to live so long as people are respected. But saying that, I do recognize what you're saying is that there is a long history of this mission civilisatrice, this white man's burden, as it was put. You go to Britain and India in the 19th century, they're going around saying, we're ending the widow burning, right?
That's right.
Widow burning is bad, right?
Yeah.
Good, it should end. Like, should not be widow burning. But the utilization of widow burning, and there may have been people involved in the project who truly believed that this was a humanitarian intervention. The outcome of that was the legitimization and advancement of a very bloody imperial project. The same with the French in Algeria or the Russians in the Middle East. You have all these interventions which may have things that we like. Yeah, that would be great if we could get rid of that. Now, you and I might disagree on what things we would like to see in a society or not, but probably we would agree, like, let's say that it's not the place of the United States to be imposing that on countries, because not only is that problematic from our perspective, it doesn't even work, right? It doesn't even do what it says on. They fail on their own grounds as well. So it really brings us to this question of this dogmatic opposition, that even if there may be a case, we're not mind readers, we can't predict the future, we can't rerun counterfactuals. There may be cases where American empire, a certain action saved lives, right? And I give a case of that where I'm pretty sure that had America not intervened, it would have definitely been more bloody. But you can't use the exception to defend the rule, which is that in general, it's going to make things worse, both domestically and very often for the people who America's bringing democracy to.
That's right. Yeah, I'm right there with you, Djene, that the United States does not have the right to impose a way of life on a foreign population. I would add that the United States federal government does not have a right to impose certain ways of life on certain communities in the backwaters of America, right? But yeah, and as you said earlier, right, the road to imperial atrocities is paved with humanitarian intentions, right? And yes, widow burning is awful, and yes, all of these kinds of things we're talking about are terrible. John Quincy Adams's perspective on this, right? It really, I tried to paraphrase it earlier, but there's nothing like the man himself. So I'm actually just going to read this excerpt. John Quincy Adams in 1821 writes, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will America's heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom of independence of all. She's the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause. She'll recommend to the world the general cause of liberty by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. This is like
Mm-hmm.
a throwback to the city on the hill image, right? Of we're going to build a city on the hill, and it's on a hill so you can all see it. And if you want to imitate it, great, but we're not going to sort of go to your hills and impose our city on your hills. She well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she, America, would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her, America's policy, would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet, which is like a headband, upon her brows would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster, the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. There's
And
this
that's
kind. Yeah,
it's oracular.
Yes, it really is. It's terrifying, and how prophetic it is. And he sort of goes through the stages of will be drawn into forever wars on behalf of other people's liberty. We might even justify it in the way that Bush did, that if there's tyranny anywhere, then democracy here is unsafe, which just seems like a logical fallacy. Our endless wars will require endless expansion of the means employed in them, right? If you say my goal is to make the world safe for the democracy, and that goal is not actually possible, then you're going to continually add new tools to your tool bag to try to accomplish that goal. And then finally, we get atrocities abroad and the decay of our own regime at home. If you're trying to force a change on a nation to make it, bring it up to 21st century American standards, you're going to have to either be involved in a very long occupation, which will breed in resentment, or do some very violent and drastic actions. And I don't want to do any of that. And I don't want my countrymen to do any of that. And I don't want any of that to happen to foreigners. And I also don't want the deleterious effects of that on our own way of government here at home.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important point, and it highlights the significance of the American Revolution and the contradictions inherent within the American Revolution. But certainly, for all the criticisms people might have towards the founding fathers and the American Constitution, this was a debate that was had. The fear, the fear of a standing army is a real fear, because this was the weapon of tyranny of the Ancien regime across old Europe. Now, of course, the fact that America had to conquer and colonize a continent created those fed into the creation of an apparatus of a standing army and war. And obviously that's a problematic thing, but it is something that these people were thinking about and aware of, the dangers of an all-powerful imperial state. And you talk about it in terms of the domestic domestic agenda, and I'm sure from your perspective, obviously you're gonna come down on the side of like impositions of DEI training or like woke culture or whatever. I would make also I would say, okay, I don't think things should be imposed on people, but also you see the same things happening in conservative states. Like one of my big takeaways from the COVID crisis was that whether you were the anti-COVID vax people or the pro-COVID vax people, both sides used that crisis to enhance the power of the state, to use a state of emergency, whether that's, obviously like the stuff that went on in Canada, right, on one hand, or Texas removing the powers of local government because they were doing mask mandates that they didn't like, or even Orban in Hungary, like using emergency powers gained during this crisis. Nobody, either on the left or the right flank of the left or right flank of capitalist politics, or the establishment, as you might call it, they don't want to let a crisis go to waste in order to impose their political agendas which I think have to be fought out and won in civil society.
Mhm.
Otherwise, any gain is fragile.
Sure. Yeah. And right. Neither of us is under the illusion that you can sort of get past politics and get past partisanship, right? This is just part of the human condition. And when you have a society, you're going to have disagreements along various fractures. The question, though, as you're, I think, saying is, at what point, at what level do those deliberations and do those decisions occur? And a feature of empire is centralization and a bureaucratic apparatus under the leader, whether it's a real leader or a nominal leader, to enforce sort of the centralized opinion. And so there's a long tradition in America, which I think is compatible with a properly understood nationalism. It's a long tradition of localism and of what a Catholic would call subsidiarity, what Americans call federalism and localism, of reserving those most momentous decisions for a lower authority. Right, state police powers is the obvious example for regulation of health and things like that. Those really should be happening closer to the communities that can make an on-the-ground decision and have a deliberation within them.
I mean, I'm generally sympathetic to that kind of perspective, because I see one of the fundamental problems with politics on left and right is that what you're hinting to is that politics has almost become, instead of something that we do, is we petition our emperor to do the thing that we want to do. So, there will be cases where I would be willing to make that devil's bargain, where I would, if some guy was going to say, like, okay, nationalize healthcare for everybody in the United States, it would enhance the power of the progressive state, the administrative state, the capitalist state. But I would be willing to make that bargain for, for healthcare for people. Not willing to make that bargain, for example, to have opinions that I might even think are like very dangerous suppressed. I'm not willing to give the FBI or anybody the power to suppress those things, because I don't trust them, because even they might suppress something that I think should be suppressed. Like, imagine I'm a medical doctor and, I have people coming in, I don't know, drinking bleach because they think it's going to get COVID or get rid of COVID. I totally understand why that person would be like, government has to step in and stop this kind of rumors going around. My fear of that is that there are just unintended consequences from that, because once you give them the powers to do that, to decide what disinformation is, it's a slippery and scary slope. And I don't trust either the liberal or the conservative elite to make decisions on my behalf. And I think a lot of modern politics on left and right, and you see it with the Trump phenomenon, with the cult of personality around Trump, or what the conservatives complain about cancel culture. We just have this like policy of appealing to the manager. We're all Karens now. We're all Karens now, because whether it's people complaining about one person complaining about a book in Florida, and then everybody suddenly panics and they take all the books out of the book library in Florida, or it's some issue, which I can't think of anything off the top of the head, but there'll be some issue where you would be like, I don't want the government telling me to do that. I think that's where we can have some, left and right can have some common ground, is that we want to see the power of the capitalist state, the administrative state, the bourgeois state, the bureaucratic state, this kind of state institution that we see, this imperialist state. We want to see that instead of being above society, it should be in the service of society.
That's right. And the way that these kinds of conversations have been unfolding on the right end of the spectrum for the last few years is around the term Caesarism, right? We love comparing ourselves to Rome, so we have to talk about Caesar. And actually, Rome's pretty good. You can't predict things through this, but it's helpful example. And so I think what the two of us are saying is neither of us want to get to the point where we need a Caesar, to sort of step in and break the dysfunction and just sort of impose a vision of order, one order or another, on a whole empire, right? If it came to that, you would say, I want a certain kind of Caesar, and I would say I want a different kind of Caesar. But I think we both agree that we don't want our country to be in that position in the first place. And I would add that the military-industrial complex and imperial interventions abroad are just making it more and more likely that we will get to that point. And I would like to do what we can to prevent that.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable point. I mean, in the Marxist tradition, we have this concept of Bonapartism, which actually Gramsci uses Caesarism as an analogy, as a synonym for it. And I think it is talking about that kind of same thing, that in a period, because we as a society are dysfunctional, are living in a dysfunctional society, we are sort of abrogating our political duties. Nobody does civil society anymore. People don't realize this, but like the amount of popular participation in politics in the 19th century was like huge. People were like in clubs, people did sit. Now people sit at home, and politics is just supporting blue or red once a year. I was talking to some on a podcast with a couple of my left-wing friends the other day, and we were complaining about we need to stop. Socialists need to stop focusing on presidential elections, and people were talking about Cornel West running for president. I was like,
yes,
it's his right to run for president. He meets the requirements. He can run for president. Like, I don't need to. He's not going to win, and he's not going to make much of a difference. I don't know why everybody is like freaking out as if it's like a huge deal. We just need to stop putting our faith in like great men to come and fix our problems and take political responsibility for ourselves, which I think is like I think a lot of people on left and right just hope for someone to fix their problems.
No one's coming to save us. We need to save ourselves in the ways that we can. And that 19th century American reality that you referred to, right? This is what Alexis de Tocqueville describes so beautifully in Democracy in America. Local self-governance, a sort of robust civil society, all of that he predicts will be evacuated by the rise of a strong centralized state, and what we would today call an administrative state, or something like that. And Tocqueville is a really wonderful resource for thinking through that process, and is in his mindset. It's fundamentally because we are more in love with equality than with liberty. So here will be my plug for sort of right-wing reading of Tocqueville, although he's susceptible to both, I think. And I guess I would want to connect that love of equality even over love of liberty, preferring equality to other goods, including liberty, community, tradition, and so on. That seems, in my mind, connected with the impulse to this humanitarian interventionism, humanitarian imperialism. We can't abide, Russia living a different way of life, or we can't abide, right? Recently in the news, Uganda, right? Even Senator Ted Cruz sort of got on Twitter and started criticizing Uganda for changing its laws regulating homosexuality. And again, like, whatever you think about that, why is a U.S. senator getting worked up about something that's happening on the other side of the world that does not touch on a direct American interest? The answer, unfortunately, is that we all care about morality and we all care about justice. And that's like a really good thing about humans, but it's also the way that we get into all of these problems, and the way that we are tempted to be concerned with intervening beyond what we should, beyond our own ambit, and then get into all of these sort of disasters and atrocities of imperialism that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, actually, the Marxist tradition, if you read Marx, he talks more about freedom than, equality or anything. That his argument is simply that you can only realize that freedom with the abolition of classes and capitalism. But actually, it is, from my perspective, the fruition of this quest for liberty, not this kind of the way that it often gets translated in the modern era into a kind of like an argument for managerial liberalism. So I think it's important discussion to have a debate. So we're coming up on the hour, but I wanted to just ask you, as a kind of concluding point,
sure,
what would you like to see in the future as America? What do you think how should America be in the world?
I think NATO has outlived its utility. I think it would have been a good idea to disband NATO when the Warsaw Pact disbanded. So if I'm going to commit to one concrete proposal, it would certainly be that could go a long way. I would like America to our leaders, our governing class, our citizens, to realize that the best way, again, to put this in my own terms, the best way for them to serve God and love mankind is to love and serve those closest to them, which is not exclusive from loving and intending the best for those on the other side of the world. But just as parents have to make decisions about prioritizing their own children over a child that they don't know and don't have a personal attachment to, our own community has to look after its own first and foremost. And the complex, the incredible complex of NGOs, humanitarian organizations, U.S. intelligence services, and military makes us sort of entangled with on every continent of the world. It's very hard to know how to undo that network. Something concrete like disbanding NATO, although I don't imagine that's going to happen anytime soon, or withdrawing from it, would be a step in that direction. But really reordering our own efforts towards taking care of the needy, the hurting, the addicted in our own community, in our own country, would cause, or maybe should go along with, a retreat from the world, from all of these countries that we built infrastructure of military bases in over the last century or the last 70 years, that have really outlived their original purpose. Their original purpose was to safeguard the United States, and then temporarily to safeguard other populations. And at this point, it's the self-licking ice cream cone. And it's a tool that's sitting around that needs to be used. And so it will be used when a crisis comes, and a crisis will come every few years on one continent or another. And so I really would like to reshore not only American manufacturing, but also the American military, and really redouble our efforts, refocus our efforts on addressing the very real dysfunctions that we have in our own country that we're ignoring, and hyping ourselves up for a moral crusade on other sides of the world.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated this exchange that we had. I thought it was quite fruitful. We don't, people on left and right don't usually communicate in any meaningful way these days. So I think it's important to discuss, where we agree and disagree, and to, steel man each other's arguments to the best of our abilities. And I do hope, Pavlos, you'll come back at some time if you have anything else you want to talk to us about the left and things like that. That would be fantastic. And yeah, we would love to see you again.
Thank you so much, Djene, for having me for the conversation. It was really wonderful.
Well, on that very pleasant note, as we say on This Is Revolution, it's so nice when we have a nice friendly exchange with our political opponents. I mean, it's obviously a lot more friendly than I have with some of my fellow leftists, I'll say that. But as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.